Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Hey there, Clean Freaks. This is Hank Balch. You're listening to episode 8, season 26 of Beyond Clean. The topic today is loaner reprocessing. On this season theme, the processes that save lives. Obviously, loaner instrumentation is one of those topics we've covered a lot on the Beyond Clean podcast for good reason. Almost all of us, in some form or fashion, will have to engage with loaners. Even if it's every now and then, it's not even a big orthopedic or neuro tray. Maybe it's that loaner scope that you're processing or loaner trial instruments that are coming in. If it's not an owned item, it falls into this loaner reprocessing category. Yes, the majority of our inventory flow from loaners comes from these orthopedic loaner trays, neuro loaner trays, that kind of content and instrumentation. So today we're going to talk about the high-level challenges, the best practices out there that I feel like are critical for us to get it right as we fight dirty in our departments. And we're going to start at the high-level logistics. We all know that getting loaners in on time, getting the right loaners in at the right place on time, and I'm using air quotes again here, for what that means. So maybe let's start with that topic, the timing topic around loaner reprocessing. So in recent years, and I'll say recent, these years are adding up here. We'll say maybe 10 years ago, there was a position paper that was published by then ISHM, now HSPA, on this loaner topic. And in that position paper, one of the things that was covered was this delivery timeline. And a question being addressed is how far in advance of the case should sterile processing receive the instrumentation? Now, if you've been with us in previous virtual conferences, we actually just wrapped up a virtual conference a couple weeks ago as the recording of this show is going on. And one of the sessions was a panel discussion where we brought in a couple of vendor representatives to ask about this process from the vendor perspective. And obviously, when we start talking about schedules and timelines, the vendors' ears perk up, right? And they say, okay, what are you asking me to do? Obviously, they've got to get their instruments to the facility because it's the surgeon that's going to be using that instrumentation for the case. And so there's a built-in timeline no matter what. The procedure is scheduled for this day, so the trays have to be there. However, the question for sterile processing is how soon before the case do the trays have to be there? And in that position paper that I referenced, there was some discussion around this. Is it a 24-hour turnaround time? Is it a 48-hour turnaround time? Is it even a 72-hour turnaround time? And since that time, there's been a lot of departments around the U.S. that have tried to tackle and answer this question around loaner timing. Typically, on the consulting side of the space, when we're out there helping facilities try to get this right, what we're seeing is a 24-hour delivery expectation. Now, that is often put in the department policy around loaners. Occasionally, that's included in kind of a vendor credentialing sign-off, if you will, especially if you have vendors and if you have a department that's utilizing some of this vendor management software and technology that's on the market today. That kind of deadline can be put into the kind of sign-on terms and conditions, if you will, for that program that all of your vendors have to sign as they check in a tray that says, yes, this tray was delivered before this 24-hour deadline. Now, if you're not using a tracking type system to track your loaners, you can still set this delivery expectation of 24 hours. But you need some kind of mechanism to track and to audit that's actually occurring. And we'll get to the paperwork side of this here in a moment. But I just want to stick just a little bit longer here on this timeline. So 24 hours, what does that mean? It means if we have a 7 a.m. case the next day, those loaners should be delivered to the department prior to 7 a.m. the previous day. Pretty simple, right? 24 hours. You wind the clock back, same time, different day the day before. In reality, even departments that have that 24-hour timeline, often what we see in the industry today is if the trays are in use in your operating room the day before, so they're being used on a different patient the day before, if they're in the facility, many times vendors will still fall into or maybe believe they're being compliant with that 24-hour delivery timeline. So the trays are on site, but they're not set up, they're not prepped, they've not been entered into any kind of system or process to say now they've been reset for the next day case. So right out of the box, we've got a problem, right? When we say and when we set this 24-hour timeline standard, what do we mean as a department in an industry? Do we mean that 24 hours prior to the case, the trays need to be reset, and the surgeon, the patient name, the date and time of the case all has to be submitted, and all that has to be done prior to that 7 a.m. mark. Let's just say again that we're working on a 7 a.m. case. Or do we mean, in the analogy that I just explained, that as long as the trays are in the facility, even if they're being used currently, we're going to count that as that 24-hour compliance. Now, either way you want to shake that, I think is completely up to the department and to the vendor community that's supporting that hospital to determine. But we should spell it out in our policy and be very clear what counts for timeline compliance and what does not. Okay. Outside of this 24-hour timeline, let's say that you're looking at a 48-hour timeline. If you talk to your vendors, many of them, even 24 hours, they feel like that's potentially too constraining depending on your market, how many trays are available, how often the doctor in question is doing this procedure. So 24 hours may already be pushing it. If you start asking for 48 hours, many of y'all who have this set into your policy, that is asking an awful lot to book up a tray for 2 days that's not being used. Because keep in mind, from the vendor and the manufacturer perspective, the only way that these trays are making money is if they're in use. If they're sitting on your shelf sterile for a case that's not happening for 2 days, what that means is that asset for that manufacturer is not creating revenue. And what it may mean is if there's enough people who have trays that are being unused and stored sterilely because of these delivery timelines, it may mean that they need to purchase even more trays to extend the size of this inventory, right? So you start talking to potentially some substantial revenue impacts. Speaking of revenue impacts, getting some of these trays to the right facility, if they're across the country or even across state sometimes, depending on how large your state is, there's a lot of shipping costs that goes into this. If you're overnighting trays in order to get that tray compliantly to this delivery deadline that Sterile Processing is talking about today. But here's the point on these deadlines and on these delivery timelines. Sterile Processing is asking for these timelines because we need time and bandwidth in our departments to ensure not only that we have the processing time to make this through, and this is one of the misconceptions I think a lot of vendors, when they hear about the delivery timeline and expectations, they feel like, well, hey, if it only takes you a couple of hours to process this thing, why on earth do you need 24 hours to process it? Well, that question is belying a little bit of an assumption about how the flow of inventory comes through our departments and what all is involved in reprocessing loaners themselves. You and I both know that part of that 24-hour timeline is, number one, we have different shifts in our departments. Not all of our departments are shift 24 hours to begin with, or staffed 24 hours. Even if they are staffed 24 hours, there's other things going on in our departments, surprise, surprise, than just reprocessing loaner instrumentation. There may be other loaners for other cases that we also have to reprocess. There's always going to be owned instruments that have to be reprocessed every day that were used the night before, the day before. There's also all kinds of quality tests, especially if we're looking at this overnight shift. There's quality tests that means our equipment is not in use during those times. If we're running BIs, if we're doing buoy dick tests in our sterilizers, if we're running the tests on our washers, on our ultrasonic cleaners, you name it, there's a lot of quality tests that subtracts time out of that workflow. There's staff meetings, there's lunch breaks, there's regular breaks, right? So like you're subtracting all of this time from the workflow. There's all of this other volume that has to be accounted for, and that's just the time component. Once the actual process starts for reprocessing these loaners, again, it's not just a quick wash, wrap it all up, throw it in the autoclave, and we're done. There's a quality assurance piece of this loaner reprocessing puzzle that many times the vendor community, I don't know if they don't really see the complexity on our side that goes through it, or if they just don't appreciate it. But when we're giving 6 trays, and if it's a piece of paper that comes along with it, or if it's put into the tracking system, that's when the quality assurance checks begin. First, we've got to verify, are these 6 trays that you told me that you dropped off actually what you dropped off? Are all the components that you say are in this tray actually in this tray? Do I have the cleaning instructions for these devices? Do I have proper containers for these devices? As it goes in to the schedule portion of this, do you actually have a case that is scheduled for tomorrow or for 2 days? Is it the right doctor, the right patient, and are you an approved vendor for this case? There's more, but that's just a little bit of the QA process that begins. Now, if the answer to any of those questions is unclear, maybe there's some confusion about the case or the patient, maybe there's some confusion about what this particular tray is called, or hey, there looks like there may be an instrument that's missing, or there might even be an instrument here that's damaged. Maybe the initial inspection from the vendor or the warehouse missed it on our inspection in the decontamination or the clean side. We caught it. Now we're in this scenario. The case is already scheduled. The patient's already taken off work. They're going to show up at 7 a.m. Or they're going to show up at 5 a.m. in the morning to get ready for their surgery. And in sterile processing now, we have found an issue with this tray. It's the paperwork, it's the instruments, the instructions, maybe it's the container issue. You name it, we've identified an issue. Do we have enough time in our timeline now to rectify that issue? Do we have enough time to call the rep? Does the rep have enough time to call the warehouse? There's all kinds of different scenarios that have to flow out of this that's related beyond just the time the process. Have we built in enough time in case part of the process breaks down to remedy that situation? It's not going to delay the case or to cancel the case on behalf of the patient, right? So all of this has to come into play as we're setting these delivery timelines. It's not just about the workflow. It's the quality assurance. It's the communication piece. All right. Speaking of communication, this is a big area of progress that I think we've made in our industry over the last 5 years. And it's the question of communicating between the manufacturing representative, the the OR scheduler, the OR itself, the surgeon, and sterile processing. Every single one of these teams needs to be aligned and have open communication flow back and forth to ensure that all the timelines that we were just talking about can be met and that the correct instrumentation is showing up at the right time, in the right room, the right patient, and the right surgeon. If we don't have this flow of communication, and I say that we've made progress because I think a lot of these new technologies out there, again, in the vendor instrument management process, even the bill pay process or the pay only process, all of that I think is coming together to bring these groups a little bit tighter so that now, as soon as that case is booked, there's a mechanism to notify sterile processing, to notify the rep, and to notify and confirm with the surgeon that a particular case has been booked, and this is the equipment and supplies that's going to be needed for that. So we've made huge steps forward on the communication piece, but it's not just communication about the case schedule. We also have the ability now in sterile processing through many of these tools to know how many and when these trays will be showing up at our door. One of the most frustrating experiences as a sterile processing technician, and quite frankly, even as a sterile processing leader, is these surprise loaner deliveries that end up happening at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night sometimes, where you think you've got the shift stabilized, you think you're going to get all the priority items done for first case the next day, and out of the blue, you get a ring on the door, and you open it and you see a vendor there smiling with 8, 16, 32 trays that you were not expecting for tomorrow's workflow or, tonight's workflow, because many times, again, they're delivering past that 24-hour, that 48-hour delivery deadline. Because of this, all kinds of things then shake out, right? Who's going to decontaminate all these trays? What's the impact on your decon staffing? What's the impact on your equipment capacity? Each one of those trays, depending on the setup of your washer, if they got multi-levels in your trays, you could be looking at, if you're just washing 8 trays, that could be 2 to 3 additional automated cleaning loads all by itself. And depending on the timing of your automated cleaning loads, that could be 20, 30, 40 minutes per load. And all of that is impacting then all of the other volume that you already had planned for that night, including potentially other loaners that were already in queue, plus, of course, all of your standard volume that's coming through with your own instrument. So the late drop-offs or the unexpected drop-offs are a huge impact to workflow. And I just alluded to the decontamination impact, but obviously there's a prep and pack assembly impact, there's a sterilization impact, there's a case picking or dispatch impact. All of that comes into play anytime and every time we've got one of these unexpected deliveries. So that communication piece that now we have access to know, hey, tonight at 8 o'clock, we should be expecting another 8 trays or another 16 trays. Even if it's beyond the timeline, that still allows us to staff up, to beef up if we need a prep for overtime or if we just need to plan the staffing accordingly. Of course, another big challenge with loaner instruments that we've covered in previous podcasts is around this IFU piece. I think it's important, though, again, to call it out. In general, IFUs are complex enough. When we get into the different manufacturers that we see coming in from the loaner instrument side of things and the different instructions for use that we see for many of these devices as compared to each other, it's really, really easy for non-compliance to creep up and then for quality issues to start surfacing because of this loaner workflow that we find ourselves in. And what I mean by that is to really lay it out on the table is you'll have different loaner IFUs require different soak times, for instance. So this is your decontamination manual cleaning soak. There'll be some that require a 5-minute soak. There'll be some that require a 10-minute soak or a 15-minute soak. Then, depending on the loaner devices that are in those trays, there'll be specific instructions around actuating the device under running water for 30 seconds or for 60 seconds. And this is any device within that tray that specifically needs to be actuated, right? So these are devices that there's moving parts with them. And you got rinsing the device under running water. Now, this could be the entire tray. It could also be specific cannulated items in the tray or whatnot. And you have different instructions depending on the manufacturer and the tray as the tray goes into the ultrasonic cleaner. Sometimes you see 5 minutes. Sometimes you see 15 minutes. Sometimes you see 20 minutes on these instructions. Clearly then, because of the diversity of IFUs and because of the complexity in those IFUs internally, if you've got staff back in the decontamination area that are not familiar with the nuances for each one of these IFUs, that's opening the door for a host of different issues around compliance and quality in the reprocessing phase. So there's been a lot of work. There's been a big push again through some of these loaner technologies and softwares out there to integrate the IFUs as a part of that tray intake. So if they want to check the tray in, they got to confirm that the IFU is on file. That's great. But just having the IFU on file doesn't mean that that technician that's in decontam on a Wednesday night knows the specifics of those IFUs as they go to decontaminate that particular tray. So we've got a potential gap in not access to the IFU because that's there, that's been uploaded, or maybe even you've been in-serviced on that. But when we're talking about multiple different loaner companies and multiple different IFU instructions, even internal to the same company, if you've got 5 or 6 different trays, one in-service 12 months ago for your technician on this particular thing may not be what you need and what that technician needs to hardwire compliance in this loaner reprocessing stage. So I want to urge you out there today, if you've become complacent on this IFU compliance piece for your loaners, I want to challenge you. Pick 3 of the top types of loaners that you may process, Stryker, Zimmer, Nuvasiv, whatever you want to do, right? Pick the 3 that you see the highest volume. And then pick 3 specific trays out of each one of those 3. So now you got 9 different IFUs that you're going to take a look at and start mapping out the differences between these IFUs. And really quickly, you're going to start seeing the complexity of this challenge. Now, for vendors that are tuning in, this is going back again to where we started with the timeline piece. Why do we need 24 hours or why do we ask for 48 hours sometimes? Why is it not okay the night before to drop it off? And you're like, hey, it's 7 p.m. You still got 12 hours, piece of cake, right? Well, the complexity of these IFUs slows down the process if we are being compliant in sterile processing. So let me speak to you technicians out there that are tuning in. I know because I started as a sterile processing technician myself, the temptation, because of all the pressures, is to find the lowest common denominator for reprocessing in decontam, and you start treating every tray the same. So what you do and what the industry does, not everybody, right? I'm not saying everybody does this. I'm saying the temptation to do this is real. You say, okay, I'm going to just soak everything for 5 minutes. I'm going to brush and flush everything for 5 seconds. Just until it's visually clean. And then I'm going to throw everything into the ultrasonic for 10 minutes. And then I'm going to throw it all in the automated cleaner. And so you treat every single tray the same. It is many times that lowest common denominator of what the IFU requires. And so you catch a lot of the IFU requirements in that process. But then all of the outliers, that one device in there that actually needs 2 minutes of actuating, or the reamers that actually need 20 minutes of soaking before they go in the process. You miss all these little outliers. It's those outliers that bring the greatest risk to our patients. It's also those outliers that bring the greatest risk on the accreditation visits. When they start looking closely at your workflow and your competency and your training and your documentation. It's also, if you're an attorney or if you've got an attorney because you've gotten a surgical site infection, it's these aspects of the process that attorneys will dig into and say, you know what? There is no evidence whatsoever that they were following this part of the instructions for use that require X amount of time doing the rinsing or the brushing or whatnot. So it's really, really critical, whatever role you play in this process, from the rep side, if you're giving in services on your equipment, from the technician side, the educator, the leader side who says, okay, sterile processing manager, you got to give your team time to understand these IFUs. You've got to give them the tools and resources to have these IFU nuances available to them when they need them, not relying on the memory of the technician to keep all of these trays straight, to keep all of these timing requirements straight. That is impossible. Let's be honest with ourselves. Nobody listening to this podcast right now can keep every nuance of every IFU straight in their head when it comes to decontamination. So you got one option. Those IFUs somehow, some way have to be accessible and available in decontam when they're needed. And compliance-wise, you should probably be moving towards some mechanism to document that you did what the IFU is asking you to do at each one of those stages. There's technology that's out there today that can do that. And I know there's more tech that's coming down the pipeline today to help us do that. All right. I threw a lot at you here in a short amount of time. We talked about the IFU piece. We talked about the timing piece. There's a training component here that we just really scratched the surface of. But I want to challenge you. I know we spent a lot of time and effort talking about care and handling of laparoscopic instruments. Obviously, we do a lot of training and attention on the instruments that we own, that stainless steel kind of instrumentation. But these loaners, they've been a headache for many, many years in sterile processing, and that headache is not going away. We're going to have loaner instruments. We can't afford to buy every one of these trays. So it is what it is. And I don't think we can afford to ask every loaner and every manufacturer to come 72 hours before the case and just sit around nice and sterile on our instrument table not being used. We're going to have to find that sweet spot in communication, delivery timelines, access, and not only access again, but doing what the IFU is telling us to do, to have time to do that, training to do that, and technology to prove that we did it. That's the challenge, but that's the process that's ultimately going to save lives. I want to thank you for tuning in to this season of Beyond Clean, the processes that save lives. I hope you found something of value, not only in this episode, but in all the episodes in this season. And I want to tell you, look forward to season 27. We got a special season here planned for you in the days to come. So thank you for all that you do out there in sterile processing land. And until we talk to you again next week, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.